What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the factory tour. I'm your host, Paul Patterson, back with you after a little 1 week hiatus. Enjoyed the Thanksgiving week off, watched some good football games, some bad football games. I'm back here after week 12, joined by my friend Mike, better known as Dynasty Zoltan. You can find him on Twitter at Dynasty Zoltan FF. Mike, how you doing today?
Good, good. Great to be back on the show.
Yeah, man, should be fun. I'm very excited to dive into our topics today. Thought we could just start though with a little Thanksgiving recap. There wasn't like a ton of actionable stuff to take away, but I definitely want to talk about Dak Prescott
Yeah.
because his hot streak just continues for another week. I remember, early on in the season, he was really struggling to score fantasy points. It was just these weird lopsided game scripts. He was really underperforming passing touchdowns. I was getting to the point where I was kind of frustrated, like definitely was getting too low on him. But now, I mean, he's just been on absolute tear. He's the QB3 on the season, and he can do no wrong the last 5 games. So what do you make of this stretch from Dak, and where do you see him now, I guess, in the like larger quarterback landscape?
Yeah, I mean he's been incredible the last over the last 5 weeks. He's got 17 passing touchdowns. He's got 30 plus points in 4 of his last 6 games and at least 18 in all of them. Really just been incredible. And it's interesting. He's producing from a fantasy perspective, despite the fact that he's not running. We saw him rushing a lot when he was younger, getting a lot of rushing touchdowns. That really hasn't returned, but he's still been awesome. And it's just because he's passing the ball at such a high level. I don't see it changing anytime soon. I think a lot of it is that the Cowboys have realized that Tony Pollard's just not the answer this year for whatever reason. And now we see Dak Prescott, first in PFF rating, second in completion percentage. He's top 5 in yards per attempt, touchdown rating, big time throw, all this stuff. He's just been a top 5 quarterback this season, and I don't see a real reason for that to change, other than age related regression that we might see 3 to 4 years from now. But for now, I think we put Dak right back where he's been for the last 3-4 years, where he's averaging 22 fantasy points a game, kind of in that second, third level.
Yeah, and I think they came out of the bye, they started throwing the ball a little bit more. I know early in the season it was also a lot of like short passing, and seems like they've been able to open things up a little bit better. It's really coincided with CeeDee Lamb being more of a featured player in the offense. So it's not to say that this didn't seem possible early in the year. He was obviously running cold on passing touchdowns and stuff, and there were things pointing to regression. But I think this is just another in a long line of lessons that you shouldn't let variance over a small sample affect your opinion of a player too much, especially when you have so many years of Dak Prescott being like a high quality fantasy asset, but also just like a high end actual NFL quarterback, which is sometimes missed in the equation, I think, when we're valuing players. I was basically to the point where I was like, why should I prefer Dak Prescott to Brock Purdy? I think it was like during the San Francisco game when they were getting the absolute just crap beat out of them. But that was definitely a mistake at that point. And so it's been humbling to see how he's done the past month or so. I will say one of my guests, I guess right before this hot streak started, I had David from the Bulletproof Discord on here, and he was preaching the good word of Dak Prescott. He was calling for, a bounce back soon, and he's looking pretty smart now, a month later with these performances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the difference, Brock Purdy 5 weeks ago was averaging more points per game than Prescott. Now he's still only 2 points per game behind Dak Prescott. The difference is that Dak is currently 4th in the NFL in expected points per game, behind only Hurts, Allen, and Herbert, while Brock Purdy is all the way down at 28th. And that's just a result of the offense. We have Dallas scoring 32 points a game, throwing the ball a whole lot. San Francisco relies on their defense and, doesn't have to throw to the same degree. So that's why you're getting a huge gap. Even though my rankings I put out 3 weeks ago, I had Dak Prescott behind Brock Purdy in the same tier. I still think there's an argument to have them in the same tier because Purdy's 7 years younger. I do think he is locked in there as a long-term starter. But clearly Dak is giving you fantasy upside that you can't get from Purdy. So especially for a win now team, it's been a struggle this year trying to find a quarterback to buy as a win now team because all of the producers were so young and so valuable. And we didn't have the vets like Tom Brady, like Aaron Rodgers, even like Matt Ryan a few years back. Now it looks like Dak Prescott's that guy that you can get for, 2 firsts or less that really is going to carry you to a title.
Yeah, he's going to be a key piece down the stretch for sure. He's helped teams, secure the bye. I actually had a really fortunate situation in one league where I had Jordan Love to start the year. I did not want Jordan Love. I'd love to talk about him next, actually, because he played on Thanksgiving as well. I eventually traded him up into Anthony Richardson, who promptly got injured the next week. And then I ended up buying Dak Prescott off of a team that decided they wanted to rebuild. I got him for like a late first and a late second and Tutu Atwell because that was right there at his lowest point. And I was like, you know what? I need a quarterback. I'm just going to buy in on the bounce back. This is a good price. Was eventually able to flip Anthony Richardson essentially straight up for CeeDee Lamb. And so the Dak Lamb stack has been carrying me to the 1 seed ever since. And it's been quite a ride.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jordan Love's an interesting guy to talk about as well. I think he had his best game of the season by quite a degree against Detroit on Thanksgiving. And he's looked really good over the last few weeks.
Yeah, it's surprising to me. I have been kind of a noted Jordan Love doubter on this program time and time again. And I mean, honestly, I wasn't even quite aware of how well he had been playing the last couple of weeks because I just don't roster him anywhere. And I don't watch the Packers that often unless they're just on red zone. And so I didn't realize, I knew he had won some games. I knew he had had some better performances, but then it was pointed out to me that, over the past month, he's been like the 4th highest graded passer per PFF, something along those lines. And so, it's possible we're really seeing him turn a corner with these young weapons in the offense, him, having limited starting experience as well. So it's possible that he was overvalued and then actually undervalued.
Yeah.
And now he's kind of reaching a point of equilibrium, but it seems pretty clear he'll be the starter moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first 4 games of the season, he basically had unsustainable touchdown luck propping him up when he wasn't actually playing that well. He had a stretch from week 2 to week 8. So that's 6 games in there where he didn't have a yards per attempt above 6.8, which is below the NFL average. Since then, over the last 4 weeks, his yards per attempt has been above 7.2 every week. It's been above 8 on average, and he's had his 4 highest graded PFF games of the year the last 4 weeks. So like you said, it looks like he's turned a corner. I think that given this is his first year actually playing, even though it's his 4th year, I don't think we should be that surprised about it. 7 of his 18 big time throws, according to PFF, have occurred in the last 3 weeks. I think we're seeing a guy turning a corner, and you mentioned those young weapons. We're going to talk about one a little bit later in this podcast, but he's got some interesting pieces there. No one really elite though. So it's pretty impressive that he's able to perform like this without any, go-to options.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. Interesting. We had another young quarterback play on Thanksgiving, Sam Howell, who I know you've been a fan of. You projected him pretty highly for the season. I remember talking to you about the Commanders in the summer, and I was shocked at your projection for Sam Howell. It turns out you were too low on him, actually. So he's been pretty impressive for fantasy. Which of those 2 guys would you rather have moving forward?
It's tough. I do think Jordan Love has a significantly higher floor in terms of the number of starts he'll have remaining in his career. I think if I were to put the number of starts remaining in his career, I'd probably favor him by, 15 plus games compared to Sam Howell. Right. I think there's a chance Sam Howell is not a starter next year, or if he is, he's in a competition with, JJ McCarthy or Jaden Daniels or something like that. Well, I think Jordan Love does have the role locked down. That being said, I still like Sam Howell as a superior fantasy asset when he does start. He's 7th in expected points per game among quarterbacks this year, 10th in points per game. That is about 1.5 points above Jordan Love. So I'm going to take Jordan Love in Dynasty just because I think he has a much higher floor. And I do think there is some ceiling to him. I've actually liked the way that Jordan Love has run the ball recently. But I still think that Howell is a decent option as like a, low end QB2.
Yeah. I agree with that. It is kind of tough between them. Coincidence, Eric Bieniemy goes from Kansas City to Washington, D.C., and Patrick Mahomes has his, worst season, and suddenly Sam Howell's just lighting up the scoreboard. Maybe he is onto something. I don't know. Apparently his strategy is just throw the ball more than anybody else. Seems to work pretty well at least for fantasy production. So other than that, not a lot to take away from Thanksgiving. We finally had Jahmyr Gibbs come back down to earth a little bit in a game. But still strong usage, still very encouraged by him overall. Amon St Brown continues to be automatic. There's nothing really to say about him except that he's just on another level. I mean, he's basically having the same year as Keenan Allen, except that he's like 8 years younger than Keenan Allen. So it's like they're just kind of the same guy in my eyes.
It's unbelievable for Amon St Brown. I mean, this season he's seen at least 7 targets in every game. He's had at least 5 catches and 56 yards in every game. He's had at least 71 in every game except for one. And if you go back even to last season, he's only seen less than 7 targets once in the last 25 games. I'm just doing this by eye, but it's insane. Amon-Ra is as locked in 18 points a week as you could possibly hope for.
He's unreal. I didn't even put Amon St Brown on the show sheet. How did you have all those numbers off just right there at your fingertips?
I have a whole Amon-Ra love diary.
Okay, gotcha. You have a shrine. You have a shrine.
Yeah, he's that guy. I just love him.
He's freaking awesome. All right. I have a quick question for you, and then we got basically 2 segments for the show. The first main segment, we're going to go ahead and re-rank the 2023 rookie wide receiver class, knowing what we know now. And then we're going to talk a little bit about trade deadlines and what to do if your league doesn't have one.
Yep.
But first, I just want to ask, because I know this is a stance that you have about Dalton Kincaid, who's really come on the last month or so. But I know you have him ranked as your tight end 1 in Dynasty. I'm not quite there, but I definitely think he's in the conversation. I'd love to hear you just make the quick case for Kincaid as your tight end 1.
Yeah, for sure. And for what it's worth, I do have Kincaid in a tier of 5. 4, and then plus Brock Bowers, I'm projecting, is going to be there as well. So while I do have him as my tight end 1, I understand arguments for Laporta, Hawkinson, and Andrews. Basically, for me, I had Kincaid as a higher graded prospect than Laporta coming out of the draft. Nothing I've seen has changed that at this point. I think Kincaid's in a better landing spot. There's more usage upside for him on a team that wants to throw the ball more, has a better quarterback, and really doesn't have good weapons. If you look at the pipeline, the Bills are going to start struggling with weapons, especially as Stephon Diggs goes past age 30. So I'm pretty optimistic about Kincaid's usage relative to Sam Laporta. What I will say about Dalton Kincaid is I don't like the way that they've been using him. His average depth of target is still only 5.7. That's incredibly low. I thought that in college he was incredible in terms of his body control on the boundary, as well as his body control and hands running down the seam. He's only been targeted on deep routes twice this season, and he's only been targeted more than 10 yards down the field 12 times. That is pathetic. They're using Dalton Kincaid basically how Zach Ertz has been used over the last decade, which is fine for fantasy. And we've seen Kincaid's fantasy production being really good over the last month. It's not how I want him to be used. I think when Dawson Knox comes back, we'll see Kincaid get some more of those slot routes that Shakir has been getting recently, where he will be targeted down the field. But for me, I just see so much ceiling with Kincaid. We've already seen the floor, which is basically a top 5 tight end at this point. So that would be my argument for him versus Laporta. I think he's just a better player than TJ Hawkinson, who has been reliant on massive amounts of volume basically wherever he's gone. The scheme is amazing for Hawkinson, but I just have never really trusted the talent. And then Mark Andrews, it's just an injury thing, as well as, being 29 years old versus 24 for Kincaid.
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. And I agree those 4 guys are in a tier. And it can be tough to choose. It's almost like your choice between them is a little bit dependent on just your team construction. Yeah. Like I don't fault anybody if you're, shedding points and you want to build for next season around Mark Andrews. I can't fault you for that. It might seem counterintuitive to trade into the older player in that situation, but you're also getting a known commodity, and he's certainly not at an age for tight ends where you're really too worried about the, the end of the career. But yeah, I mean, with Kincaid, you just have to hope that at some point they do use him in sort of that more downfield, because if they keep him in the role he's in, I mean, he is kind of going to be Hawkinson-esque, working his way down the field 8 yards at a time. But there is proof of concept in college, like you said, that he can do it. And obviously being tied to Josh Allen is a big plus.
And you look at guys like Hawkinson, we don't know if Kirk Cousins is going to be on this team for long. And if Hawkinson is all of a sudden the second or maybe third option on a team that doesn't have a good quarterback, that isn't going to throw for 5,000 yards as a team, then you're a little bit more concerned. Although I will say Hawkinson has a 25% air yard share so far this season, by far a career high. And that's a number I've been tracking for Hawkinson, just to give the relative points for the other guys. Mark Andrews is at 19, Sam Laporta is at 21, and Dalton Kincaid is only at 11% air yard share. So that's just a bit of a numbers behind how Kincaid is really only being used in the short game.
Yeah. Yep. But I think those guys are really the cream of the crop. You got kind of Trey McBride behind them, Travis Kelce for your contenders, and then somewhere back there, Kyle Pitts,
if you just hate yourself.
Yeah, which I do. I do hate myself.
Same here. Yeah.
I just took him in a startup mock draft for the site I write for in the 5th round. And it's like, I guess, I mean, this is my obligatory pick, but it doesn't feel good. Yeah. So I already was sad about Pitts in the last show that we did. So I'm going to just move along.
Yeah.
Let's get into our main segment here. Looking at the 2023 rookie wide receivers. I was really excited to do this because this class has just been so good overall, but so weird in how they got there. Like there's just been so many wide receivers passing each other like ships in the night, like switching up week after week. At one point, Zay Flowers looked like the wide receiver 1, and then Puka, and now Puka maybe isn't the wide receiver 1. Maybe it's Tank Dell. So we're gonna look at these. We both ranked our top 10. I went ahead and just combined them into a little quick consensus. I broke my ties in favor of my own ranking because I'm the host of the show.
It's your podcast. That seems fair.
But yeah, so we're going to go 10-1 here, and we'll just talk a little bit about each guy, what we think, how we got to this ranking. And I have some questions I wrote down as well, just to check with you and your process. So
before we get going, can I interject real quick?
Please.
So I did a lot of research on this topic. I'm actually writing about this for my patrons this week, so it was well timed. So I did some research on how good these rookies have been compared to precedent as far as rookie wide receiver seasons. So typically we expect your average rookie wide receiver drafted in the top 3 rounds to average about 32 catches and 430 yards for a season, which seems low, but again, this is an average top 3 round wide receiver since 2005. This year, our rookie wide receivers in that range are already averaging 32 catches and 411 yards, and they have 5 weeks left. So we can see some really impressive season by these rookie wide receivers. In terms of points per game, they're averaging 6.1 points per game, which would be 4th in the last 18 years. And the wide receiver classes that beat it, the legendary 14 class, the 2019 class that's become legendary as well, and then the 2020 class, again, Jefferson, CeeDee, Higgins, Ayuk, etc. So while I don't see necessarily the superstar like Odell Beckham or AJ Brown in this class, we'll get to that later. Clearly, this is a very, very strong wide receiver class.
Imagine how good those numbers would be if we just put Puka in the 1st round and Quenton Johnson in the 5th round, like they probably should have been.
I know, right? It's absolutely should be. If you just want to look in terms of the number of players. I tracked every single drafted wide receiver going back to 2005 in their rookie season. So that and the 2023 class had the most wide receivers in the top 50 in terms of points per game. They had 6. So if you just want to look at the depth of this class, how strong they've been, that just tells you a lot about this rookie wide receiver season, having 6 of the top 50.
Yeah, it has been very impressive. It's been great, rostering some of these guys. We're going to start down at the bottom, though, where maybe not super inspiring. We both had a different player at number 10, and both of these were a player that was left off of the other list. So I had Marvin Mims as my number 10 wide receiver, and you had Quenton Johnson. They've both been pretty disappointing overall. Mims kind of flashed some big plays early in the year, and it was like, oh man, once he gets on the field more, he's going to do great things. But then he just kind of didn't get on the field more, and he also stopped making those plays. And so he's sort of become a bit of an afterthought. And honestly, for me, just sort of a default pick here because I liked his profile. But not expecting a whole lot from Mims moving forward. I did want to start with him, though, because your list actually goes down through 14, and he was nowhere to be seen. So he's actually behind, for you, Trey Palmer, Michael Wilson, Jonathan Mingo. So walk me through that.
Yeah, I will clarify because I'm realizing that that's a mistake. I filtered to rookies with 30 or more targets as the basis of my list.
And he doesn't have 30.
He has 21 targets this season in 11 games. So that's why Mims doesn't appear on my list. He would probably be 12th behind Quenton Johnson, Dontavion Wicks. Who has been looking good. I know we're not going to talk about him, but if you're looking for a deep flyer, he'd be the guy.
Yeah.
Listen, Mims just hasn't done anything. He's got 21 targets on 151 routes. That's up to 13% target share. He had a pretty poor target share in college. I know there were aspects of his profile, particularly his early breakout age, that were incredible, but I view him as a pure one trick pony, deep threat. I don't find him ever being anything resembling fantasy relevant, just because he's going to get, a lot of games with one catch for 18 yards, a few games with 2 catches for 80 yards and a touchdown. But much like Donovan Peoples-Jones before him, I'm not going to be investing in a guy like Marvin Mims personally.
Yeah, I definitely think that's fair. I honestly might have to consider some of these other names after him. Yeah, he's at a 14% targets per route run for the season, but that's actually been lower in recent weeks than it was earlier in the year. So he's got a lot of work to do to round himself out as a player if he's going to do that. But for now, not actually doing all that much more than Quenton Johnson, who we'll talk about next, because you had him as your 10th guy.
Yeah, and listen, Quenton Johnson has been absolutely terrible this season. Like there's no other way to put it. He's looked awful. All of your concerns about him in college have come to fruition. I was very low on him coming out of the draft. Obviously, that's held for so far. But there are some things to like, which is basically the fact that he is young, the fact that he was a first-round pick, and the fact he's tied to Justin Herbert. So I look at these guys, and from a dynasty perspective, I don't view a guy like Marvin Mims as having any upside. And while I think the odds of Quenton Johnson being valuable are very, very low, there's at least some chance there. So I'm going to take him. Also, there's the name brand, right? Like if he just randomly has a 4-catch, 100-yard touchdown game in week 18, someone's going to talk their way into him this offseason. So I'll take Quenton Johnson over the Michael Wilsons of the world, but I'm not high on him by any means.
I agree with you. I'm actually going to swap those two guys right now and put QJ as my 10th. I think it was more of a spite pick to just leave him off the list.
I don't blame you.
But I think you're right because he absolutely has sky more potential in the sense of like they could just throw positive reports out there in the summer and people will be like, oh man, here it comes for Quenton Johnson. Just needed a year to get acclimated to the NFL. That can totally happen. And then you can flip him for a mid-second or whatever, and you'll be happy about that. And these other guys, they have a lot more work to do to get to that point. So let's jump up to our next guy here where we were pretty much in agreement. Jaden Reed for us ranks 9th. I believe he was 8th on my list, 9th on your list.
Yep.
So, I like what I've seen from Reed so far. I did think he was an interesting prospect. I loved grabbing him, late second, early third in rookie drafts when I had those picks. Kind of started out the year with a couple of pretty solid volume games and then kind of dropped down, but he's really been asserting himself in recent weeks. I think he actually had his best game of the season volume wise on Thanksgiving. And JJ Zacharyson likes him. But there's a lot to like. You got the second round draft capital. So he's just an interesting player who's already making some splash plays.
Yeah, and I like Jaden Reed. I would just ask everyone to put a little bit of water on that fire because he still is only seeing a 20% target rate. He is not shown to earn targets at any level maybe high school. I didn't go back to that. But in college, he only, I believe, had 730 yards as a senior. Yeah, he had Keon Coleman playing there with him, but his prospect profile is interesting. I like a lot of what he's done this season. Most notably in reception perception, Harmon had him second among rookies against man. But the issue is that I view him really as kind of just a flanker guy. He's playing 78% in the slot, but he's not getting open particularly quickly against the slot. He's actually been more effective playing on the outside. I view him as kind of a Darnell Mooney type. Maybe he has a Christian Kirk type ceiling. But for me, I'm not super high on Jaden Reed, and I think that this offense is going to be pretty egalitarian for a while. I don't see him as the type to ever earn a 25% plus target share. So long-term wide receiver 4 on your fantasy team is what I see from Reed.
I mean, first of all, shout out for dropping the word egalitarian in
thank you.
Football podcast. But second, I wanted to say you do actually have tiers for these guys listed, yeah. And I have tiers not written down, but in my brain. And you have this guy. So you had QJ in a tier at the bottom, and then Reed in your tier 4, along with a couple of other names. So I'm curious to see, how you feel about him relative to those guys. But I agree with you. I don't think the ceiling is especially high. I actually really like the Christian Kirk comp. That would be a pretty favorable outcome for him. Mm-hmm. So, I actually had a discussion about this in the Bulletproof Discord I think it was during Thanksgiving. He was having this big game, and I was like, guys, I think Jaden Reed is a sell. And they were like, for what? And I was like, well, I don't know if his price is actually there, but if somebody's going to give me a late one, if somebody's actually willing to pay up, even if it's like a buy teams first round pick, I'm taking that for sure.
Absolutely. I don't know how much you've scouted the wide receivers in this upcoming draft. I'm not fully there yet, but I think Jaden Reed, he was a late second round pick last year. He's clearly gone up, but I would not pay more than a mid second at this point for him.
Yeah, I agree with that. He's played well. It's not to knock on him. It's just he's done well in certain areas, but not enough to say that he has this massive ceiling where you can't just re-roll him into a more exciting prospect in the upcoming class. And next on our list, we have Demario Douglas, who you're notoriously high on. You actually got me on. You got me on him. I was able to get him in a few leagues because of you, so I appreciate that. But you have him in this same tier with Reed. So why don't you walk us through the Douglas profile and kind of how you view him moving forward too?
Yeah, I absolutely love Demario Douglas. As you said, I've been high on him for a long time. Learned about him early in the offseason, mostly just following Patriots camp very closely. And he's been awesome. So in the last 5 weeks, he's run 25 or more routes. That's really when he's become a full-time member of the offense. His yards per route run over that time has been 1.9. Overall, his yards per route run on the season is 2.01, which is 4th among rookies behind only Dell, Nakua, and Rashod Rice. And we just have a very efficient, solid, smart football slot weapon. Smart football player. He's really good after the catch. He's second in the NFL in yards after catch per reception. He's broken a tackle on 50% of his catches. I just think he's a really solid player who's going to be a pro for a long time. And obviously he's doing this all with Mac Jones at quarterback. Patriots are going to have a new quarterback next season. They do not have any other weapons in the offense. So I could see Demario being the number 1 next season as well. I just see a lot of upside for this guy. And I think, I said early in the year, I think he's a future 80 catch, 1,000-yard guy. Nothing I've seen really has put me off that path.
Yeah. Per Fantasy Life's utilization report, Demario Douglas's 26% targets per out run is actually second of every wide receiver we're going to talk about today, behind only Puka Ngata. So he's been very good at drawing volume when he's been on the field. I could probably draw volume if I was competing with Devontae Parker and Mike Gesicki for targets, but you got to play against the guys that are on the field with you, and he has done a good job of that. And he seems like he has some ability to make some big plays. Like he's not just a short area kind of wide receiver. So, they call him Pop for a reason, right?
I agree. I think there's more to his game. as far as being utilized down the field. We know how good he is after the catch. So yeah, I think there is more to his game.
Yeah. So I think he's an interesting guy that, like, it's very league dependent. Like, some leagues, he's definitely rostered by people who like know what they have. But I definitely think of all the wide receivers that you could be excited about in this class, he's the one who's most likely to be rostered by somebody who just doesn't really know what he is. Like, they picked him up off waivers in the summer because they had a spot, and they're not really, paying attention to the increased usage. This is a guy I think you could definitely go snag for like a late second in a ton of spots. And I would definitely go do that because he's turning himself into a full-time player. Like you said, not really a lot of competition there. It's not really, there's not a lot of outs for that to improve. So I would just go and get the guy that we think is going to have volume and cash that in. I'd be very happy to do that.
Yeah, 100%.
Next guy in this group, last one in the tier for you. I actually have him in a tier above, just above these guys, is Rashod Rice. I don't fully know what to do with him. Like, I have him kind of in a tier by himself between the group we just talked about and then my next group. Because I wasn't in on him as a prospect at all. Like, I was like, okay, great. The Chiefs drafted another bust in the second round, right. Hello, Mr. Mecole Hardman, Sky Moore, Rashod Rice, right next in the long line. But he's done some pretty interesting stuff so far. The Chiefs refuse to just play their best wide receivers. So he still only has a 47% route participation on the year, but 25% targets per out run. That's just behind Demario Douglas.
Yep.
Very efficient yards per out run. I mean, he's done some cool stuff on the field. He's in a Patrick Mahomes offense. So to me, there's a lot to like. And he had a really good game this past week too.
Yeah, I like Rashod Rice, right? There's a lot to like about him. Out of rookie wide receivers, he's third in PFF grade, first in yards per route run, second in targets per route run, as you said. I actually have him third behind Puka and Demario, but either way, there's a lot to like from Rashod Rice. My issue with him is I do think he's pretty much a one-trick pony. His ADOT is only 5.5. I looked at all receivers with more than 30 targets this season. And that gives us a total, apologies, one sec. That gives us a total of 87 wide receivers. He is 86th in average depth of target, a full yard lower than Jackson Smith-Njigba, if that gives you an idea of things. 78% of his targets have been behind the line of scrimmage or within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. That's pretty terrible. He is awful against man defense, against man. His win rate versus man is just terrible. So he's really just a zone beater that they're using a lot in manufactured touches. I view him as a guy who's going to be a useful role player for a long time, but I think that you can't extrapolate his 25% target per route run to higher number of routes. I just don't see him ever being an elite option there. I think KC is still looking for their elite option, but being paired with Patrick Mahomes and being a good zone wide receiver and a short weapon is useful. He's ninth in the NFL in yards after catch per reception. There's a lot to like from Rice, but I think that there's a ceiling as well, and it's not that high.
Yeah, I was going to go ahead and point out the ADOT issue as well, and just all the short targets. That is definitely the knock. He's basically what people wanted Kadarius Toney to be in this offense, right? Like, he's getting those manufactured touches. He's being very efficient on limited volume. But like you said, that can come with some ceiling concerns. For what it's worth, in week 12, he was able to get up to 68% of the routes, had a 32% target share in that game, but again, an ADOT of 4.4. So still those very short area touches. He's going to have to prove that he can, succeed somewhat down the field on normal routes in order to really work in a full-time role. So that still remains to be seen, but his trade value is certainly going up. I like that. And he's probably going to carry some hype into the off season about, future potential breakouts.
Yeah. And you mentioned his big week 12. He only had 3 routes more than 10 yards past the line of scrimmage in week 12. So just to show that he's still really only being used in the short game.
Yeah. So definitely some concern there. Got to take that into account. I think there's a pretty good gap from Rice to the next tier of guys where these are some like really legit players who all have, maybe some concerns, but lots of green flags, if you will, about, future upside. And while he is 4th for you, he's 6th for me, and he does end up here as our next guy, and that's Josh Downs.
Yeah.
Love Josh Downs. I was definitely too low on him coming into the rookie draft season. I didn't see a lot of upside for him. I didn't think he was even going to play like in 2 wide receiver sets, and I was worried about the volume with Anthony Richardson. And he's just surpassed all of that and proven himself to just be a lot better than I gave him credit for. But he has been awesome this year. He's got, on the season, he has, sorry, I still have week 12 stats in front of me. On the season, he's looking at, 22% targets per out run, 19% target share. And that's come up a lot in recent weeks as his role has grown in the offense. He's basically matching Michael Pittman for targets, recently.
Yeah.
So you've been high on Downs. Why don't you talk about him a little bit here?
Yeah. So Downs was my wide receiver 2, really, coming out of the draft. I had him just behind Jackson Smith-Njigba. And yeah, I agree. There's a big tier gap here. So I classified this next tier as elite role players, where I view them as, probably the second best wide receiver on a team, could probably be a second or third option on a fantasy team as well. Josh Downs has been awesome this year. Some of my favorite numbers for him. First of all, Matt Harmon's reception perception. Absolutely loved him. He was first among rookies against both man and zone success rate. And his 82% success rate and 86% success rates would have ranked first and third, respectively, out of all 2022 wide receivers. So he's already an elite separator and elite route runner. Player profile has his 53% win rate versus man defense as 5th in all of the NFL this season. So he is already an elite route runner, and that's exactly what we saw in college. He has 0 drops, and he has become a go-to 3rd and 4th down target. He is 12th in the NFL on 3rd and 4th down targets. But what's crazy about that is those 29 targets are only on 69 targets total, because he has missed some time due to injury. He's the highest percentage of 3rd and 4th down targets in the NFL. It just shows that he is a clutch player. He's going to be a go-to guy. The issue comes with quarterback, and that's why I can see why you have him at 6th. I can see why you would put Flowers and Addison above him, particularly Flowers, because of the quarterback. Josh Downs in week 1 and week 4, when Anthony Richardson played a full game, only saw 13% targets per route run. So there is some concern there, but I just think he is an excellent player, an elite slot weapon. He has the 3rd highest slot rate of anyone in the NFL, so that's clearly his role. I just think he's going to be an excellent player for a long time.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you want to rank the talent above the situation. Like we don't know exactly how things are going to play out. Richardson can still grow as a passer, and I'm sure he'll eventually see what Downs can be as a receiver. I guess they should change his name to Josh 3rd and 4th Downs.
I like that.
Yeah. But yeah, I love Downs. I've been doing some soul searching, trying to figure out how to rank him alongside Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, Jackson Smith-Njigba, because there's definitely some anchoring bias that goes on with these first round players. We invested in them a lot more highly. The NFL invested in them more highly. And so it's kind of hard to navigate, like weighing our priors, because the priors matter in the sense that they have more value insulation, and the fact that the NFL liked them more is it's predictive. But then you also look at the player's actual production. That's got to weigh in too. So this is like a constant struggle. Ultimately, I can just put them all in the same tier as a cop out and just say, whichever one's the cheapest in your league is the one you should go and get. But would you explore, like, since you have Downs ahead of Zay or Addison, would it be worth your while to even go and explore like tiering down from those 2 guys to try to get Downs plus?
Absolutely. And to be clear, I have Downs above personally. I would not recommend trading Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison for Josh Downs, because I always like to play with a value-based mindset. Yeah, I absolutely would do that. I think that Josh Downs is a better player than those 2. I think he could easily have more production than those 2 next season. And it's not like Flowers and Addison are helping you that much this season. They're all basically, wide receiver 3 flex options. So if you can tier down, get a second round pick on top, I would absolutely do that. I think especially from Jordan Addison, you could probably get a pretty big plus to go down to Josh Downs. All of these 3 players that we're talking about, would you give a late first for these guys?
Let's say
you're the 4 seed. You're not gonna get a bye.
See, my initial instinct was like, yes for Addison and Flowers and no for Downs, but I just said they're in the same tier, so I know that that's not right. That's just my brain doing weird things. If I have a bye, I think I'd go ahead and do that. If it still has the potential to be like a 107, 108 pick, I don't feel the need. Like, I don't think that they've shown themselves to be such elite players that I can't replicate that with a first round pick. I think there's still more upside in the pick and more flexibility into the offseason. So these are guys where like I'm trying to acquire them, but not really with picks. I'm trying to acquire them by offloading like older wide receivers that are sort of in that zone. If I'm tearing things down, I'm trying to flip my running backs to people that can use them, things like that. I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way to try to buy this archetype of a wide receiver with rookie picks, because it's like you're sacrificing liquidity and you're sacrificing some level of upside for what, yes, it's a sure thing, but it's like, is it a sure thing that's ever going to put 18 points per game in your lineup? Probably not.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, what you can do is try to use, let's say you're falling out of the playoffs. You could try to use, a vet plus your, early to mid second. So like Cortland Sutton and a second or something like that.
Chris Godwin, Terry McLaurin, like those guys for me, I'm happy to add to them to get these receivers. If people still think, those are really great players that they can, trust in their flex or whatever. That's kind of how I would like to do that and get out of those middling players. But yeah, the next guy above Downs, it was really a tie between Addison and Zay. They both came in the same spot. I went ahead and put Zay next because I have Addison one spot ahead of him. So Zay Flowers comes next, and he was the one. I mean, he came out week 1 with like the 38% target share or whatever, and it was like, oh man, it's wheels up for Zay Flowers. It was a lot of manufactured touches, but it was still like really good to see. But as the year has gone on, I don't know, it seems like his role has shifted a little bit. He's still gotten some of those manufactured touches, but it seems like less so in recent weeks. Maybe losing Andrews is affecting things too. I'm not sure, but you were kind of low on Flowers as a prospect, if I recall correctly. So what have you seen from him so far this year? You talked about Rashod Rice as kind of a gadgety player. Is it fair to say Flowers is more than that? A good amount more than that?
I think he is more than that. Zay Flowers, so I mentioned earlier, Rashod Rice, 78% of his targets have been within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. That number is 64 for Zay Flowers, which is closer to a guy like Demario Douglas than a guy like Rashod Rice. And Zay Flowers, at least we've seen some elite skills from him. So, 24% missed tackle rate is way higher than all of the other rookies we're comparing him to. JSN Downs, Puka, Douglas, these guys are all below 14%. So clearly a big weapon after the catch. The 25% target rate, I like that a lot. But it's a low average depth of target. As you mentioned, it's a lot of manufactured touches. He is a better player against zone defense. And to me, what really shown for when going through these numbers was he's 4th in the NFL in play action targets, and the highest percentage of his targets are coming off of play action. So whether these are the manufactured touches on like an RPO essentially, or whether these are play action rollouts where he's been used on deep crossers, clearly that's a way that they're getting him open. I don't think he's going to be a wide receiver that creates space for himself. I think he needs the offense to create space for him, but he can thrive when they do. So I have him kind of in that like Robert Woods, Golden Tate level wide receiver in terms of a career outlook for a guy like Flowers. I think he's a good player, but I don't see, wide receiver 1 upside for him.
Yeah. So you're looking at kind of just a year in and year out kind of wide receiver 2 guy who, maybe he has a season where he runs hot on touchdowns or something, and he can give you that wide receiver 12 type of year. But yeah, he's probably not going to break your league. And that's why he's like we talked about, not the kind of guy I want to go out and send a first rounder for, because the thing about it's like, hypothetically, you can say, sure, the value works out, but like, you only get one first rounder that you can go ahead and trade for somebody. Ultimately, I like to aim a little bit higher and just see how can I work this pick into a trade for like a true difference maker, somebody that's either going to help me win this year or somebody that I think is a true like building block for my team. And I don't think Flowers is that. I think he's going to be a very useful guy, somebody you're going to certainly want to have, especially in like your start 3 wide receiver leagues for a long time. But not a game changer per se. And I think that applies to Jordan Addison as well, who I have these guys basically back to back. Like, depending on who had the better week last week, I might move one ahead of the other. But you did have Flowers one spot ahead of Addison. I had it flipped. So could you tell me, we'll move into the Addison discussion, and why don't you start by telling me, why is Flowers marginally ahead of Addison for you?
He's a better route runner, in my opinion, by a significant margin. According to Player Profile, Zay Flowers was 12th in win rate versus man this season. Jordan Addison was outside the top 60. Not what you want to see. I also think that I also know that Jordan Addison will never be the wide receiver 1 on his team, and he doesn't have a long-term quarterback. So I view Flowers as the slightly more talented player, but basically a toss-up with a better situation. So that's why I have Flowers higher.
Right. And I guess the success versus man probably has something to do with those concerns about like press coverage and stuff too, with his frame.
And the other thing is Addison is getting a little bit. So he has 8 end zone targets this year. He's the only rookie with more than 5. Right. I don't think that there's anything about Addison's profile that tells me that that's sustainable. So I view him running a little bit hot in touchdowns. He's had a few big plays. I think it's really flipping a coin between these two, but I will take Flowers.
You don't think the skinny guy that can't beat press coverage is he's not a featured end zone weapon?
It's crazy, right? I mean, yeah. I think a lot of it is the Vikings didn't have a rushing touchdown until like week 10. But yeah, it's I don't think that that's going to continue.
Yeah, it's pure variance for sure. He is averaging a solid 15 points per game since Jefferson's been out, but again, a large part of that does come from the touchdowns. So he's been more useful this year than Flowers in your lineup than, JSN. But it is important to remember that variance with the touchdowns is playing into that. And also, we shouldn't project Justin Jefferson to miss most of the season, every year. So that is a problem for him. And again, it's razor thin with me for Flowers and Addison. Both have some red flags, both have some positives to their profile. Ultimately, both wide receiver 2 types moving forward.
And what I think is interesting is a guy that you had below Flowers and Addison, who I have a full tier above, is Jackson Smith-Njigba. So before I tell you why I am in on him, why do you have him below Flowers and Addison?
Honestly, okay, this is really tough for me. I have them together in a tier, and it's just JSN has just been so underwhelming since the start of the year, which I'm sure you know. But as we kind of talk through the profiles of Addison and Flowers and sort of like look at how their ceilings are maybe a little bit limited, I am tempted to go back to the drawing board on this and really think about it, because with JSN, at least we believe in theory that ceiling is there, based on his college production. Like you don't just outproduce Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson in college by accident. Like that means something. And that does mean enough to give him some leeway in the NFL. So, so far this season, he's down at 18% target share, 18% targets per out run. That's worse than like a lot of guys that we've talked about so far.
Yeah.
But competing with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, that matters. The Seattle offense has just been like totally out of sorts at times. That matters. And he's flashed some plays in recent weeks. So this is kind of a situation where I actually won't be surprised if 2-3 weeks from now, JSN has retaken his spot ahead of those guys for me. And maybe you're just being a little more forward thinking here. So are you seeing kind of an upward trend from him recently?
Yeah. So On the season, Zay Flowers yards per route run 1.58. Jordan Addison 1.60. Jackson Smith-Njigba, if you exclude the first 4 weeks where he basically wasn't playing and certainly wasn't being targeted, his yards per route run is 1.62. So ahead of those other two guys, basically in the same exact range. Much like Dalton Kincaid, I don't like the way that JSN is being used. His 6.6 average depth of target is 83rd in the NFL, again, out of 87 players. So it's not great, but we're seeing him flash quite a bit recently. 80% success rate for zone is very solid. 5th in target separation, according to Next Gen Stats. Geno Smith's been pretty bad this season. Maybe we get a new quarterback. Tyler Lockett, $9 million of dead cap and $17 million of savings if he's cut after the year. I just see a lot of runway for JSN to improve. I thought he was way better as a prospect, and nothing that he hasn't looked bad. I mean, he had that awesome one-handed catch last week, but he hasn't looked bad. He's just not being used in the right way. And Flowers and Addison haven't looked great. So to me, I'm just going to stick with my preseason priors. I think, like you said, in this range, I want to go for upside. And I think that there still is some superstar upside for JSN. I don't think it exists for the other two guys.
It's definitely a compelling case. The yards per out run point is key because, you know, Addison runs so many routes for the Vikings. And so like his volume stats are higher. But when you do look under the surface like that and you see, you know, relative to the number of pass plays in the offense, he actually hasn't been all that much more productive than JSN. Right. So that is a key point. Again, I'm taking all this, honestly, I brought you on the show for selfish reasons. Like I wanted to know what you thought. And so I thought, oh, we'll just record it for everyone else, but like, it's really for me. And so I do like that take. I don't have a lot of JSN. I didn't get much of him during rookie drafts. And I just have been kind of hesitant to pull the trigger on any kind of like trades for him. But something I might want to look into here with the improvements recently. And like you said, things might break his way during the offseason. So
yeah. And he's a guy that I would probably trade a playoff first for him.
Oh yeah. I think I would do that. Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah. And the fact that I was so quick to say that I would do that makes me think I need to go ahead and change my rank. Cause I'm thinking, I mean, like end of the round, first round pick for him with his prospect profile. It seems like such a no brainer. So I think I was a little too fixated on maybe the downside and not seeing all the upside there, but that is a good point. But I think we can both agree there are two wide receivers that have distanced themselves from the rest of the class. It was a tier of one for a little while there, and we've had a new challenger approach in recent weeks. Neither of these guys had the first round pedigree. Both were guys that I overlooked during the rookie draft process. I drafted 0 shares of Puka Ngata in rookie drafts. And I think I had one Tank Dell that I traded for a 2025 second after week 2. So wasn't feeling too great about that. But we're going to talk about Puka next because this was a dead tie. I had Tank 1, Puka 2. You had Puka 1 and Tank 2. I'm breaking the tie in my favor. So Puka Ngata comes next. He's been awesome this season. He's got a 30% target share on the year. He's 8th in the NFL in total targets. I think he's like 9th in fantasy points per game. He's up over 16. So, I mean, he's been phenomenal. Talk to me about Puka Ngata and why he is your rookie wide receiver 1.
Yeah, and honestly, I want to talk to you about this too, because these two were incredibly close, and I am not confident that I have Puka over Tank. The reason I had Puka higher is simply the things that he's been doing have almost never been done before as far as a rookie goes. He's essentially having the best rookie season outside of Chase and OBJ. He has dropped off quite a bit. That's important to note. Part of that coincides with Cooper Kupp coming back, but it's not like Cooper Kupp's been doing that well. And as we talked about earlier, Puka is still getting 7 or more targets in basically every single game. So not a lot to dislike on Puka. 33% air yard share is awesome. 13th in PFF grade on the season, 27% target rate. The problem with Puka is that he does not have the prospect profile, and I don't think the film is that good. Like, he's really, like, if you ask me what he's really good at, he's excellent at finding holes in the zone. He has really good hands. He's pretty good after the catch. I like his body control. I don't know that he's that explosive. I don't know that he's that excellent of a route runner. I don't know that he's that physical. I don't know. I like Puka a lot. Obviously, he's great. I think people, like, I recently posted a poll, him or a first round pick that was or a late first. It was basically 50-50. I think that's insane. Like,
yeah.
You have to take Puka Ngata as a top 15 dynasty guy. I have him in the top 12. I think pretty comfortably, but
yeah.
I don't know. I'm rambling. What do you think?
I have both these guys in my top 12 dynasty wide receivers. I mean, like you said, it's unprecedented what he's been doing. Honestly, I don't even attribute the recent weeks to Cooper Kupp necessarily. I think they had the game where Stafford got hurt, which impacted things. Then you had the game with Brett Rippon, which you could just throw that right out the window. That guy couldn't do a thing in that game. And then, this past week, they absolutely blow out the Cardinals. You have the weird, like, Kyron Williams receiving touchdowns. They hardly even need to throw the ball or try to get the ball to their playmakers for most of that game. I think it's just variance. You look at the first 5 weeks of the year for CeeDee Lamb, it was pretty similar. Like, the Cowboys were just blowing people out or getting blown out every week. They weren't throwing the ball that much. And, whatever, the production wasn't there. But even if you split the season up, weeks 1 through 4, he had a 32% target share. Kupp comes back. Since then, he's still had a 29% target share. So it's like, I don't even think Kupp is like taking over. I think Puka's still been the main target there. I'm very, very impressed with him. The main thing for me that splits, there's two things that split the two, Tank Dell and Puka Ngata. You look at since week 8 when Tank came back from an injury and really started getting that full route share, 93% routes in week 8. He's had a 26% target share, 26% targets per out run. That's actually better than Puka during that stretch, but it's pretty close to Puka season long on a per route basis. But he's doing it at a much higher ADOT, 14 ADOT on the year versus Puka at 8. And he's also playing with CJ Stroud, which is like absolutely huge for me, because I see them as, if you want to say interchangeable as talents, or at least in the talents that score fantasy points, I'm going to take the guy that's got CJ Stroud for the foreseeable future versus the guy who has Matt Stafford maybe for next year. And then who knows, right? That's really the big dividing factor for me.
Which makes a lot of sense. It's tough. Like, I do think that Tank Dell is a great player. I don't know if we want to start talking about him already, but
let's just go back and forth.
Yeah, you mentioned the last 4 games. Essentially, he's got a 2.39 yards per route run in the last 4 games. That's great. 30% air yard share on the season, is 27th in the NFL. It's interesting. He hasn't been used how you would expect, to given his size, if you didn't watch any of his film, where he is being used down the field, especially on outbreakers. He's been excellent on, outs and comebacks and corner routes. His ADOT and slot rate is basically the same as guys like Mike Evans, Calvin Ridley, Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave. Despite the fact he's 5'8", he is really being used as like the true Y receiver, as an outside threat, only 29% slot rate. I think it's great for him that Nico Collins is there, soaking up a lot of times the harder matchups and oftentimes the press matchups. So that's great as well. Yeah. We still have only seen 3 good games for him. 3 games with 114 or more yards. He hasn't gone above 72 in the rest of the games. So I still want to see a little bit more consistency. I know last week he had like a 60-yard awesome catch that came back because of illegal formation, something like that. But I don't have a lot to argue against Tank Dell. My question would be on both of these guys. Do you view these guys as true superstars? Because we've talked about how good of a wide receiver class this is. Right. But I think the fact that we have 3rd round pick Tank Dell and 7th round pick Puka Ngata leading off our dynasty rankings, not to fall too much into what it was previously, but I don't have either of these guys in my top 8. I don't know if that's rare or not. But for such a good wide receiver class, there doesn't seem to be a true game breaker.
No, I mean, I think that's consensus. I think you're probably still higher on these guys than the consensus because I think the community at large is pretty like fairly slow to catch up on these lower drafted players. But I mean, there's just a lot of elite wide receivers in the NFL right now. Like if you just think, Jefferson, Chase, Lamb, St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave,
AJ Brown, and Tyreek Hill.
Right, that's 8 already. So it's like I think it's very fair to not have Puka or Tank ahead of any of those guys. Obviously, with Tyreek, he's the sore thumb in terms of age there. But like
it's okay. He's got unless you're without run above 4.
Unless you're just exactly. Unless you're just now starting like a 2-year rebuild, you shouldn't really care about the age for Hill. Like he's still playing as good as anybody in the league. He's 29. Like it's not. I don't think the sky is falling with him. So I think it's very fair to have him there, but I think that's where they belong. Like I think after that you get into, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, Stephon Diggs. Like I don't care if you have him ahead of any of those guys because what they've shown is pretty much that they can match that.
So that's where I have the top 8 you mentioned, and then I have Tank Dell, Puka Ngata, Ayuk, Waddle, and Devonta Smith in kind of that next tier.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't know, like I've found over and over again that I just don't think that we're very good at evaluating upside. Like people were kind of mixed on Amon St. Brown after his first season, but there were very few people that were like, yeah, this guy's going to average 19 points per game, over the course of his.
I get a lot wrong. You mentioned Sky Moore earlier this episode. I get a lot wrong. That was the one thing I was right on more than anything. I called Amon St. Brown Antonio Brown after that first year and said he was going to average 18 plus points a game. But
then you deserve your props for that because what I heard from most people was like, yeah, I mean, he's going to get targets, but like he's probably, kind of a wide receiver 2 type of guy. Like he doesn't get downfield targets. So like, what's he really going to be able to do? He can't just have a 30% target share forever. And it's like, well, so far that seems to be the case. Honestly, with Puka, I cannot speak to their film, but in terms of like how they accumulate fantasy points, I see a lot of similarities there. Like if he's going to have a 30% target share on these somewhat lower ADOT routes, but they're just going to constantly hit him on these outbreaking routes, or in-breaking routes. I don't really see why he can't be similar, to that archetype. And then with Dell, I kind of think I don't want to say he's like Tyreek Hill, but like, cause he's not, but he's like, this guy, I mean, just watching him, not even being a film guy, but just like watching him, the plays that he makes, it just seems like he succeeds all over the field. And he's just like so dynamic and explosive that it's hard for me to count him out of anything exactly.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I am going to move Dell above Puka because I think the upside is just greater when you factor in that he has CJ Stroud. Like, yeah, there's a chance. Like I think Tyreek Hill's an interesting comp. One that Dell reminds me of quite a bit is Stephon Diggs. Okay. And I think he's more explosive. I think he's worse after the catch, but there's some similarities to Diggs there. And if you told me, like, I think CJ Stroud is one of the top 5 pocket passers in the NFL already. And if Dell is going to be partnered with him for the next, 5 to 10 years, that's obviously massive. One thing that we didn't talk about, which I think is important, particularly when speaking about comparing guys like Addison and Zay Flowers and Jackson Smith-Njigba to guys like Tank Dell. Tank Dell is 2.5 years older than Jordan Addison and Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's 2 years older than Puka Ngata. I don't care that he's going to be 30 2 years sooner. That doesn't matter to me. But when you look at his value, he needs to be unbelievably productive over these next few seasons from a market value perspective in order to maintain a top 12 status and then to make it actually worth it, right? Like he is less than a year younger than Jalen Waddle and Devonta Smith. So I know he's a rookie and that's important, but let's not forget his age.
That is important. It's easy to forget, obviously, because there's just not a lot of rookie wide receivers that are already 24 during their rookie seasons. But it is pretty important to remember that. I seem to forget it every week. That is his age, but it's a good point. He has to succeed like right away. Like you look at Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, like they're not really having that like league breaking season that we would have hoped for this year, but it doesn't matter because they're both like 22, 23 and they still have another year to like kind of come into their own. What I will say with Tank is like, it's a good sign that he's already scoring 16.5 points per game on the year.
Totally.
You know, he's outscoring Devonta Smith and Jalen Waddle this year. So it's like, I think it's very possible for him to deliver on that, especially if we have, you know, we already have the quarterback in place. CJ Stroud, you know, is going to be one of those guys you want to bet on to lead the league in passing yards. So I do think that he's set up to hit the ground running like right away, you know, in future seasons. But
I agree with that. I think it just needs to be noted that, like, for instance, Nico Collins is 6 months older and has the same yards per route run this season as Tank Dell. So
right.
Again, I like Tank Dell. He's going to be partnered with CJ Stroud forever, hopefully. However, maybe CJ Stroud is just that good because Nico Collins certainly isn't that amazing, right? I have him at kind of 25, 26 in my dynasty ranks. But he's doing the same thing that Tank Dell is this season. So you gotta take it a little bit with a grain of salt.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm learning anything from this discussion, it's that wide receiver evaluation is just super complicated. And ultimately, like, we're gonna get a lot of stuff wrong trying to figure this out. You know, this top 10 might look ridiculous a year from now because there's just so many variables, so many things change. But with the information that we have, I think this is a very solid list. So I'm going to go top down now, 1 to 10. We've got Tank Dell and Puka Ngata basically in a dead tie at the top, slight nod to Tank Dell. Then we have third JSN, Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers, Josh Downs, Rashod Rice, Demario Douglas, Jaden Reed, and Quenton Johnson.
Where did you have Demario Douglas, by the way?
I had him just, I think, one spot behind
like 8 or 9.
Had him. I had him right after Reed instead of right ahead of Reed. So right there.
Sounds good.
But yeah, I mean, he's definitely on the rise. I'm going to move us along quickly here to this last segment, and we'll do it pretty fast, but just a couple of questions. I want to talk about trade deadlines. In leagues that have deadlines, they've either like already passed or they're coming up this week. So I'm not going to focus too much on like, what do you do at the trade deadline? But I want to get your thoughts, first of all, on whether you are mostly for or against trade deadlines. Being in as many leagues as you are, I'm sure you're in some of both. But what is your preference?
Yeah, and I commission like 40 leagues or something like that. All of mine have the same rule. You cannot trade in the playoffs. You can trade right up until the week 14, but you can't trade in the playoffs. Okay. I am pretty strictly pro trade deadline. I would honestly, if I had my druthers, would probably make it more like this week rather than week 12. Rather than week 14. The reason is, first of all, there's not a single sports league that I know of in the world where you can acquire a player during or right before the playoffs. Whether it's, European soccer where it's January, July, and August, whether it's, every single American sports league. Trade deadlines exist for a reason, and I know that we play this game on paper and on computers, and there's not team chemistry and all this bullshit, but it just seems a little bit ridiculous to me that, let's say this Jonathan Taylor injury happened in week 15, that I could just go buy Zach Moss for like a 3rd round pick and put him in, and he'll be a top 5 running back on the week. So the argument for a trade deadline is that it's realistic to every single sports league ever. The argument against a trade deadline is that it is technically optimal in terms of value for a league. It helps out rebuilders a lot to have no trade deadline, because then, my week 17 Zach Moss is now worth something, but I don't think it's worth that exchange. I think it's pretty stupid in a dynasty league where, you have 30-man rosters to go pick up, if there's no trade deadline in the playoffs, can one team use Adam Thielen in the semifinals, lose, and then trade him to the team they lost to for them to use in the finals? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't think it promotes like good team building. But I don't feel like that strongly against it. I am in leagues with no trade deadline, and it was not like a hold up for me.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, it sounds like you feel fairly strongly about it, but But no, I hear you. I mean, I think there's good arguments on both sides. I was a pretty firm trade deadline person for like the first 2 years I played Dynasty, and then over time I've become more against it. But I play in a pretty healthy mix. Like I'm almost like 50-50 in my leagues. I have like a little chart where I try to keep track of which leagues have deadlines and stuff, so I can make sure I make those moves first. But yeah, so I think the best case I've heard against it was from Adam Harstad. He's kind of anti-trade deadline, and he said basically something along the lines of what you said. It's just the idea of creating balance and parity in the league over time. Not having a trade deadline does allow those rebuilders to offload some of those expiring assets. Contenders, if they're really backed against the wall, more likely to overpay for those assets, like an Adam Thielen or something, or a Zach Moss, and that redistributes value to other rosters in the process. I do like how it kind of keeps everyone engaged during the fantasy playoffs, because like unless your league has a consolation bracket or something, there's not a lot of reason for the teams out of the playoffs to even like check their sleeper app or be like even paying attention to how the playoffs are going. So I kind of like that the opportunity for trades keeps people paying attention, like builds a little bit more excitement for the playoffs, and actually almost lets the teams that are out of it participate via trade. So I do think that is at least something in the pros column. But I've seen on Twitter, like people talk about the no trade deadline leagues. It's like, well, it's just an arms race in the playoffs, and people are just going to go buy all these superstars in the playoffs, and then one guy's going to get a super team and everybody's going to quit the league or whatever. I think that's pretty overblown.
Yeah.
You think about most leagues, like even if there is a trade deadline, by the time the playoffs start, there's usually a couple of teams in the league that are already like super stacked, that it's like, how do we beat these guys? And even if they're allowed to trade, there's nobody they're going to acquire that's really going to increase their win equity by more than, a couple percentage points. So honestly, I think most trades that happen during the playoffs are pretty suboptimal, like from an EV perspective. And I kind of like letting contenders shoot themselves in the foot in that way.
Yeah. And that's, I agree with that point, right? It's helpful to the rebuilders to have no trade deadline or a later trade deadline. I just don't think I think you should get rewarded for building your team earlier, right? And there's some rewards for that. That's why, like, I only play in leagues that have bye weeks, because I think, you should have credit for having a good team all year. I just think it's like, I know this isn't a real sport, but it's just ridiculous to have a guy who was already on another playoff team who has been on your team for a week, who's now going to like be a big part of your playoff push. This isn't redraft where you're picking up guys off waivers. Like just do your business early. Like in week 12, go pick up. And I like it because it means that you have to build with more depth, right? Like you need to cover for injuries. I have a starting QB3 on all of my bye week teams. Even if I have Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes, I'm rostering, Derek Carr there, because if one of those gets hurt, I need a quarterback to play. And I think it's stupid to just be able to trade for, Gardner Minshew in week 16 if you need him.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I agree with the concept of it. I think it ultimately, a lot of it does come down to preference. Like, what kind of a game do you want to play, right? It's a little bit different strategy. You're talking about building depth, building a team that can go the distance during that sprint, right? Like, if you have Jonathan Taylor and he gets that injury in the fantasy playoffs, you don't have a backup. Like, that is a huge blow to your championship opportunities if you have to go roll out, like, I don't know, Khalil Herbert or whatever instead. So I totally see it from that angle. And I think you just have to join leagues that like align with what you want to do as a player. I'm pretty flexible. Like, I'm cool doing some that have deadlines and some that don't, and just trying to build my teams in different ways. I think the more important point, other than just sort of pontificating about the pros and cons, I had to get you back for the egalitarian. So I went with
I like it. That was a good one.
We could talk about like, how should you actually approach things differently if you don't have that deadline. And I think you've already hinted at it, which is you don't have to worry as much about depth. And I think in that case, like, you want to go hard at the starting lineup. You want the best possible lineup of starters that you can, because you do have kind of a fallback. If you lose one of those guys, you don't need to be as prepared. So you can lean a lot of your dynasty value into that starting lineup. I think that is a key difference when you don't have a trade deadline.
Yeah, and that's why knowing your league rules is super important. That's a very good point.
Yeah. So because if you lose a guy in your playoffs, they're still going to have some value. You can go trade that guy and you can go get a fill-in from somebody else, most likely. So you're ultimately just better off having like a full lineup of superstars if you can. I mean, that's best in any situation, but when you need to worry about injury fill-ins and stuff, you have to devote more of your roster value to that. So like I went out and bought Adam Thielen for a third from a tanking team in one of my trade deadline leagues because I just wanted to have another guy. Like he's not a starter for me, but it was worth it for me to trade a third just in case I need a guy, because I didn't want to have to start like, I don't know, Hunter Henry or something in my flex, like if I didn't have a guy. So that's how you do it. But you can get bit in these no deadline leagues, like when you have that temptation to trade and tinker with your lineup. Like last year, I made a big trade to try to get Stephon Diggs because I lost Cooper Kupp. Like I don't remember what week that was, but it was like during fantasy playoffs or like right before the fantasy playoffs. And I still had a pretty good lineup, but I was like, I need a heavy hitter. So I went out, I traded like Kupp plus to try to get Diggs. And then the guy put up 4 points in my lineup in the finals. So it's like, you think you're building these super teams, but at the end of the day, a lot can happen in 1 week and that can really blow up in your face.
Yeah. And I mean, all that you're doing is try to like up your percentages, but like, Travis Etienne is averaging 18 fantasy points a game this year. Brian Robinson is averaging 14 fantasy points a game this year. Those 4 points give you like a 3% better chance of winning. Like it's just, this is why this is such a heavy game of variance and the best team doesn't always win. So while it's worthy to do it, and I mean, the bigger difference is getting, Adam Thielen versus Hunter Henry, like you're saying. But yeah, it's ultimately the crux of your team, the core of your team should be built up well in advance.
Yeah. And that's also why if you're going to make big purchases and buy players, like you'd be better off doing that early in the year to help you get a bye week. Yeah. That's the single biggest thing you can do to actually give yourself a chance to win. Like acquiring an upgrade in week 17 during championship week, that boost to your odds just pales in comparison to the difference between being the 5 seed and being the 2 seed. Like it's night and day. So that's really when you want to go and make your big trades. You don't want to just like try to survive the year and then buy pieces later. Like build the super team. You're still better off doing that ahead of time, even if you don't have a trade deadline in your league. So
yep, agreed.
That's a good point. All right, perfect. We got through that talk then. And I definitely liked hearing the other perspective. I totally see the pros to the deadline. So if you guys are watching on YouTube, by the way, leave a comment on the video and tell me if your league has a trade deadline, whether you like it or you don't like it, all that stuff.
By the way, I did just get offered Puka straight up for Tank Dell, and I declined it. So I guess you convinced me.
Progress.
You convinced me on Tank. I think I convinced you on JSN. So yeah, we're both learning stuff as we go.
It's a great show if we're both changing our rankings afterward. That is how you know it was a fruitful discussion. So love to hear it. Those two guys though are great. I think they're definitely close. Before we get out of here, Mike, any final thoughts about today's show or just anything?
Keaton Mitchell has a 55% missed tackle rate. That is crazy. That's my final thought. Completely random. Otherwise, yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Go follow Mike on Twitter at Dynasty Zoltan FF. Go get his Patreon as well. He was just citing a whole bunch of really cool stuff from that historic data and everything that he writes up on there and does a lot of things. So go check out his Patreon as well. And his podcast, the Dynasty Zoltan podcast. I am Paul Patterson, and you can follow me on Twitter at Paul_DFF. You can find any of my written work over at dynastyfootballfactory.com. If you're listening to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, if you could leave a rating and follow the show, that would be awesome. If you're on YouTube, if you could subscribe, also be awesome. Otherwise, just have a great week. I hope you can qualify for your fantasy playoffs, maybe get a bye week, and I'll see you here next Tuesday.